The chandelier cast a golden glow over the sprawling penthouse. As glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and the scent of expensive cigars mingled with aged whiskey. The elite of Manhattan had gathered, dressed in designer suits and evening gowns, sipping on cocktails worth more than some people's monthly salaries. It was another extravagant night in Ethan Sinclair's world, where power, wealth, and arrogance reigned supreme. Ethan, standing near the bar, exuded effortless confidence. His tailored black tuxedo hugged his tall, athletic frame, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room with calculated amusement. At just 34, he was one of the most powerful billionaires in New York. Real estate mogul, tech investor, and a man whose name alone could turn boardroom deals into gold. Sinclair, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Gerald Langford, Ethan's closest friend, if one could call him that, strolled toward him, a smirk playing at his lips. Gerald was shorter, stockier, and had an air of mischief that often bordered on cruelty. "You always claim money can fix anything," he mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But tell me, can it truly change people?" Ethan raised a brow, intrigued but wary. Gerald's challenges were always absurd, a dangerous blend of ego and recklessness. "It already does," Ethan replied coolly. "Money makes the world go round, my friend. It bends wills, buys allegiances, and opens doors that would otherwise remain shut." Gerald chuckled, shaking his head. "You make it sound so simple. But I don't think you understand human nature as well as you believe." He leaned closer, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Tell me, Sinclair, could you take a woman from the street, a nobody, a beggar, and turn her into someone fit for this world of yours?" Ethan scoffed, taking a sip of his whiskey. "That's not even a challenge. I'm serious," Gerald pressed, his smirk widening. "I bet you can't do it. 3 months. Take a woman with nothing, no money, no connections, and turn her into a lady who can hold her own among the elite. Make her unrecognizable." Ethan glanced at him, his ego flaring. The challenge was ridiculous, but backing down? Unthinkable. "What's the wager?" Ethan asked, setting his glass down with a quiet clink. $2 million, Gerald said smoothly. "But there's a catch. You have to marry her." Silence. For the first time that evening, Ethan actually hesitated. Marriage? Even as a game? It was a commitment, an inconvenience. But then he saw it. The way Gerald's lips curled into that knowing smirk, the way the surrounding guests leaned in, eager for his response. It wasn't just about money. This was about pride. And Ethan Sinclair never backed down from a challenge. 3 months? Ethan repeated, his tone almost amused. 3 months, Gerald confirmed. Turn her into someone the world wouldn't dare look down upon. Ethan glanced out the vast window, his gaze settling on the streets below. From this penthouse, the city seemed like a glittering kingdom, one he ruled with effortless command. But even from this height, he could see them. The forgotten, the lost, the invisible, the ones he never spared a second glance. And then, he saw her, a lone woman, huddled near the curb, her thin figure barely visible under the flickering street lamp. Her clothes were tattered, her face hidden beneath a mess of curls, and the way she clutched a battered tin cup told him everything he needed to know. She was desperate, a nobody, perfect. Turning back to Gerald, Ethan smirked. "You have a deal." The night air was crisp as Ethan stepped outside the penthouse, Gerald following close behind. The towering skyline stretched above them, but Ethan's attention remained on the woman. As they approached, he got a closer look. Her hands, rough and scarred, gripped the thin fabric of her coat, as if it were the only thing keeping her from vanishing into the cold. She looked up, startled by their presence. Her eyes, deep, wary, and filled with a quiet strength, met his, and for a moment, Ethan hesitated. There was something different about her. Not just the desperation, something else. "Excuse me, miss," Ethan said smoothly, his voice laced with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "I'd like to make you an offer." She stiffened, gripping her coat tighter. "I'm not interested," she muttered, looking away. Gerald chuckled under his breath. Ethan ignored him. "You don't even know what I'm offering," Ethan pressed. She finally met his gaze again, this time with defiance. "I don't need handouts." Ethan smirked. "Good. Because this isn't charity. It's business." That caught her attention. "Business?" she repeated skeptically. Ethan gestured toward his sleek black car parked nearby. "Come with me. Let's talk." She hesitated, her eyes scanning him for deception. And then, after a long silence, she exhaled and muttered, "Fine." As she stepped toward the car, Ethan felt an unfamiliar sensation crawl up his spine. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what he was about to get himself into. Because this wasn't just a bet anymore. This was the beginning of something far, far more dangerous. The car was warm. Too warm. The contrast between the chilled night air and the heated leather seats made Naomi uneasy. She shifted slightly, glancing at the man beside her, who exuded an effortless confidence that both intrigued and unsettled her. Ethan Sinclair. His name carried weight, power. Even she, living in the shadows of this city, had heard of him. A billionaire real estate mogul, ruthless in business, untouchable in his world of excess and privilege. So why was he sitting next to her? Why had he, out of the thousands of people in this city, picked her? Naomi knew better than to believe in luck. Luck had never been on her side. The car glided through the streets of Manhattan, its smooth movement a stark contrast to the chaos of the world outside. She folded her arms across her chest, her muscles tensed in anticipation of whatever game this man was playing. "You're quiet," Ethan observed, his voice breaking the silence. Naomi turned her gaze toward him, her dark brown eyes unwavering. "I don't trust men who make vague offers in the middle of the night," she said coolly. "Especially men who wear suits is worth more than an apartment." Ethan smirked. He liked that, her directness. He expected fear, desperation. But Naomi was neither intimidated nor easily impressed. "Interesting." "You're not wrong to be cautious," he admitted, adjusting his cufflinks. "But I'm offering you something no one else will." Naomi scoffed. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he countered. "You have nothing, no job, no home, no security. I'm giving you an opportunity to change that." Her fingers instinctively tightened around the tattered sleeves of her coat. He wasn't wrong, but that didn't mean she trusted him. "At what cost?" she asked, her voice steady. Ethan leaned back, watching her closely. "Marriage." Silence. For a moment, all she could hear was the hum of the car's engine, the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then she laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Right, because that makes sense." Ethan didn't flinch. "Think about it," he said smoothly. 3 months. That's all I need. You play the role of my wife. Let me transform you into someone who belongs in my world. And in the end," he shrugged, "you walk away with more money than most people see in a lifetime." Naomi's stomach twisted. Marriage, not love, not companionship, just an agreement, a transaction. The same way rich men bought and sold stocks, buildings, businesses. Now, he was trying to buy her. Naomi turned to him fully, her eyes narrowing. "Why me?" she demanded. "You could pay any woman, someone already in your world. Hell, Someone who actually wants this. So, why me? Ethan's jaw tensed. He didn't owe her an explanation, but something in her eyes made him hesitate. She wasn't like the women he usually dealt with. The polished, desperate socialites, the ones who pretended to be in love with him, but were really in love with his bank account. Naomi was real, raw, a challenge. That was why. But he wasn't going to tell her that. Because you need this and more than anyone else, he said instead. And because I want to prove that money can change anyone, even you. Naomi bristled at his arrogance. And what do you get out of it? She asked. Aside from your little social experiment? Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. That's not your concern. That was the problem. Every part of her instinct screamed danger. This man, this world, was nothing but trouble. But what were her alternatives? Another night on the streets, another day of scavenging for food, avoiding the leering eyes of strangers, hoping that tomorrow wouldn't be worse than today. Ethan Sinclair was arrogant, infuriatingly so. But he was also offering her something she hadn't had in years, a choice. And even though every fiber of her being told her to run, she found herself staring at his outstretched hand, hesitating for just a moment too long. 3 months? She whispered. Ethan nodded. 3 months. Her fingers twitched, her breath hitched. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she reached forward. Deal. Naomi regretted it almost immediately. The moment they arrived at Ethan's penthouse, she felt the weight of her decision settle over her like a suffocating blanket. The elevator ride up was silent, tense. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a world so far removed from hers that it might as well have been another planet. Marble floors stretched endlessly. Crystal chandeliers bathed the space in a golden glow. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the entire city, sprawling beneath them like an endless kingdom. And she felt small. This is where you'll live now, Ethan said, stepping past her without a second glance. Your room is down the hall. Clothes will be delivered in the morning. Naomi barely heard him. She was still trying to breathe. She didn't belong here. You good? Ethan's voice pulled her back. Naomi swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Just adjusting? Ethan tilted his head slightly, observing her. She was holding it together well, but he saw the flicker of vulnerability beneath the surface. You'll get used to it, he said simply. Then, without another word, he walked away. Naomi let out a slow breath. She wasn't sure if she ever would. That night, Naomi lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the lavish guest room. The bed was softer than anything she'd ever slept on. The silk sheets felt foreign against her skin. She should have felt safe. Instead, she felt trapped. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She had just sold herself to a man who didn't care about her beyond the limits of a wager. Tears burned the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had survived worse. And if this was what she had to do, to escape the life she'd been living, if this was the price of survival, then she would endure it. She had no other choice. The next morning, Naomi awoke to the sound of knocking. She blinked, disoriented, before realizing where she was. Miss Carter, a voice called from the other side of the door. Breakfast is ready. Miss Carter. She almost laughed. She hadn't heard her last name in years. She had almost forgotten it. With a deep breath, she pushed back the covers and forced herself to her feet. This was her life now, at least for the next 3 months, and she would survive it, no matter what it took. The courthouse was a cold, unfeeling place. The fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the drab gray walls. Rows of uncomfortable wooden benches lined the room, occupied by strangers with legal woes of their own. none of them caring about the bizarre transaction about to take place. Naomi sat stiffly on one of those benches, her fingers clenched around the thin fabric of the dress she'd been given that morning. It was a simple off-white sheath, slightly too big for her frame, the kind of thing someone would pick out in a hurry, because no one cared how she looked, least of all, the man sitting beside her. Ethan Sinclair, dressed in an expensive, custom-tailored suit, tapped impatiently at his phone. His expression was blank, but Naomi could see the irritation in the way his jaw clenched. He hadn't spoken to her much since she moved into his penthouse 2 days ago. He had been busy, or maybe he just didn't think she was worth his time. That suited her just fine. "Mr. Sinclair," a voice called out. Ethan exhaled sharply, slipping his phone into his pocket before standing. He didn't look at Naomi, just gestured for her to follow. She did. The judge barely glanced at them as they stood before his desk. "This is a civil marriage," he droned, reading from a piece of paper. "Do both parties consent to this union?" "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation, his tone clipped. Naomi swallowed. She could feel the eyes of Ethan's assistant, Celeste Monroe, boring into her from across the room. Celeste had made her disdain for Naomi clear from the second they met. "You don't belong here," her eyes seemed to say. "You never will." But Naomi lifted her chin and forced herself to speak. "Yes." The judge nodded, flipping through the papers in front of him. "You may sign here." Naomi hesitated for only a second before taking the pen. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, as if this moment, this choice, was something her body was rejecting. She signed her name, her fingers trembling slightly. Ethan took the pen next and scrawled his signature with zero hesitation. That was the difference between them. For Naomi, this was life-changing. For Ethan, it was just another deal. The judge stamped the document, barely lifting his eyes from the page, as he uttered the words that sealed her fate. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was no celebration, no kiss, no tenderness. The moment the papers were signed, Ethan turned to Celeste, his voice all business. "Make sure the press doesn't get hold of this until I decide how to spin it." Celeste gave a short nod, her ice blue eyes flicking to Naomi with the barest hint of contempt. "Of course, sir." Naomi felt a sharp pang in her chest, but she pushed it down. This wasn't a real marriage. This was a contract, one that she had agreed to. So why did it feel like something inside her had just been taken? The limousine ride back to Ethan's penthouse was silent. He didn't speak. He didn't even look at her. Naomi kept her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window as the city blurred past. Was this what it was going to be like? A marriage where she was nothing but a shadow in Ethan's world? When they arrived at the penthouse, Ethan finally spoke. "You'll stay in the guest room," he said, already walking ahead of her. Naomi blinked, surprised at the rush of relief she felt. She wasn't naive. She had spent the last 2 nights fearing what would happen once they were officially married. Would he expect something from her? Would she have to pretend? But Ethan made it clear. This arrangement had nothing to do with romance. "You'll have everything you need," he continued as he led her down a long, pristine hallway. "Clothes, food, whatever. Just don't cause problems." Naomi bit back the retort, rising in her throat. Don't cause problems. Because that was all she was to him. A problem to manage. They stopped in front of a door, and Ethan pushed it open. Inside was a bedroom. Her bedroom. It was beautiful, too beautiful. The walls were painted a soft ivory, accented with elegant gold trimmings. The bed was enormous, the kind you'd see in a luxury hotel, covered in crisp white sheets Everything in this room screamed comfort, and yet Naomi had never felt so out of place. "You can settle in," Ethan said, already turning to leave. But before he could step out, Naomi spoke. "What happens now?" Ethan paused. For the first time since they met, he hesitated. Then he turned back to her, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. "Now," he repeated. Naomi nodded, crossing her arms. "I married you. I'm here. So what happens next?" Ethan studied her for a moment before responding. "You become someone worth my time." Then he walked away, leaving Naomi standing there, alone. His words burned into her like a brand. The news broke 2 days later. Ethan Sinclair, billionaire heir, marries a mystery woman in secret ceremony. Who is Naomi Carter? The shocking marriage that has New York's elite talking. The tabloids had a field day. Naomi barely had time to breathe before the world turned its eyes on her. Strangers speculated about her background. Socialites whispered behind their hands, questioning how someone like her had trapped a man like Ethan Sinclair. And Celeste? Celeste made sure Naomi saw every single article. One morning, as Naomi stepped into the dining room, she found a magazine placed deliberately on the long marble table. She picked it up, her stomach tightening at the headline. A social experiment or a publicity stunt? Ethan Sinclair's unusual wife. Naomi's hands clenched around the glossy paper. She knew exactly who had left this here. Something wrong. Naomi turned to see Celeste, standing near the kitchen, a cup of coffee in hand, her lips curled into a smirk. Naomi exhaled slowly, setting the magazine down. "No," she said evenly. "Nothing at all." Celeste's smirk widened. "We'll see." Naomi hated the way her blood boiled. She was done being looked down on. If Ethan wanted her to prove her worth, then fine. She would. But not for him. For herself. Naomi had been in Ethan's penthouse for a week, but it still didn't feel like home. Not that it ever would. She wasn't here because she belonged. She was here because a man with too much money and too little conscience had made a wager. Every morning, she woke up to the sight of luxury, silken sheets, towering windows, with a panoramic view of New York City, a walk-in closet filled with designer clothing she hadn't chosen. It should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like a prison in disguise. Naomi quickly learned the rules of Ethan's world. Don't embarrass him. Don't question him. And most importantly, don't expect anything from him. Their interactions were brief, cold, and transactional. Ethan left early for work and returned late, barely acknowledging her presence. Naomi had never been ignored so completely in her life. And yet it was clear he expected something from her, a transformation, one that she refused to give. "You need to learn how to conduct yourself," Ethan said one morning over breakfast, barely glancing up from his tablet. Naomi had barely touched her food. "Excuse me?" she asked, eyebrows raised. Ethan took a sip of his coffee. "You're my wife now. You're going to be seen with me. You should at least know how to act the part." Naomi let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "So what? You want to turn me into one of those perfectly polished women in your social circle? A trophy wife?" Ethan set his tablet down, finally looking at her. "I need you to not embarrass me." Naomi met his gaze, unflinching. "Then maybe you shouldn't have married me." The room fell into tense silence. Then, to her surprise, Ethan smirked. "You're right," he said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "I shouldn't have." And just like that, he walked away. The staff in the penthouse treated Naomi with quiet politeness, except for Miriam. Miriam was an older woman, in her 60s, who had worked for Ethan since before he made his first billion. She didn't speak much, but when she did, Her words mattered. One afternoon, as Naomi sat alone in the massive dining room, pushing her food around her plate, Miriam walked by with a tray. "You need to eat," she said, setting down a cup of tea. Naomi glanced at her, hesitating. "I'm not really hungry." Miriam sighed, sitting down across from her. "That boy upstairs," she said, referring to Ethan, "has no idea what he's gotten himself into with you." Naomi frowned. "What do you mean?" Miriam gave her a small, knowing smile. "He thinks you're the one who has to change." Naomi studied the woman in front of her, warmth flickering in her chest. For the first time in days, she felt like someone saw her. She picked up the cup of tea, exhaling slowly. Then maybe it's time he realizes he's wrong. Ethan had warned Naomi that she'd have to make an appearance soon. That appearance came in the form of a charity gala, an event filled with Manhattan's most elite, ruthless, and judgmental individuals. Naomi didn't ask Ethan if she had to go. He had simply informed her. "You'll need a dress," Celeste had said, voice dripping with false kindness. "Something appropriate." Naomi clenched her fists but forced a smile. "How thoughtful of you." Celeste smirked. "It's my job to make sure you don't humiliate Ethan." Naomi tilted her head. "Must be exhausting." Celeste's smirk vanished. Round 1, Naomi. The venue was stunning. The kind of place that screamed old money and exclusivity. Naomi stepped inside, feeling every pair of eyes turn toward her. She knew what they saw. A black woman in a designer dress, standing beside Ethan Sinclair, an outsider in a world where she didn't belong. Whispers buzzed around them like insects. "That's her? Did you hear how they met? Is this some kind of joke?" Naomi refused to shrink. She held her head high and smiled, not because she felt comfortable, but because she refused to let them win. Ethan barely glanced at her. She barely glanced at him. They weren't a couple. They were two people locked in a battle neither had agreed to fight. It didn't take long before Gerald appeared. He was exactly as Naomi had imagined him, a smirking, smug embodiment of privilege. "So, Sinclair," Gerald said, swirling his whiskey. "How's the little experiment going?" Ethan tensed beside her, but Naomi spoke first. "I'm standing right here, you know." Gerald smirked. "Of course you are." Naomi held his gaze. "And yet, you're talking like I'm not." Ethan actually looked amused. Gerald chuckled. "Wow, this just got interesting." Naomi took a step closer, her voice dangerously smooth. "You think this is funny?" she asked. "That a man like Ethan Sinclair, so confident, so powerful, has to make bets just to prove his worth?" Gerald's smirk wavered for the first time. And then Ethan did something unexpected. He laughed. A genuine surprised laugh. Gerald narrowed his eyes, scowling. Naomi turned to Ethan, crossing her arms. "Don't get comfortable," she warned. "I'm not doing this for you." And with that, she walked away, leaving both men staring after her. That night, as they returned home, Ethan broke the silence. "You handled yourself well tonight." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "Was that a compliment?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "Don't let it go to your head." Naomi smirked. "Too late." He studied her for a moment, before shaking his head. "You really don't care what people think, do you?" Naomi tilted her head. "No, Ethan," she said softly. "I just don't care what you think." His jaw tightened. But there was something new in his expression. Something he hadn't expected. Respect. The penthouse was silent when they returned from the gala. Ethan was unusually quiet. Naomi, on the other hand, was still buzzing with adrenaline. The way Gerald had looked at her, mocking, dismissive, amused, had made her blood boil. But she had held her ground, and she had seen something shift in Ethan's expression. Respect. It wasn't much, But it was a start. Naomi didn't expect Ethan to acknowledge what had happened at the gala. But the next morning, something strange occurred. When she walked into the dining room, expecting the usual icy silence, she was met with something different. Ethan looked up from his coffee, and he spoke first. "You didn't embarrass me last night?" Naomi blinked. "Wow, is that the closest thing to a compliment you're capable of?" Ethan smirked. "Don't push it." She picked up a piece of toast, eyeing him. "You enjoyed watching Gerald squirm, didn't you?" Ethan took a sip of coffee. "More than I should have." Naomi chuckled, shaking her head. "Glad I could entertain you." Ethan glanced at her, something unreadable in his gaze. "You didn't just entertain me," he said. "You handled yourself." Naomi's smile faded slightly. Was it possible? Was he actually acknowledging her? She decided not to push her luck. She simply picked up her tea, taking a slow sip. Good to know. And for the first time since she had stepped into this prison of glass and steel, the silence between them wasn't hostile. Over the next few days, something shifted between them. Naomi still hated the situation she was in. Ethan was still an arrogant, privileged, cold-hearted businessman. But now, there was something unspoken between them. An understanding, a truce. That didn't mean there weren't still battles to fight. Celeste was furious. Naomi knew the other woman hated her. She saw it in the way Celeste's lips curled when she passed by. In the way she always had some cutting remark ready. "You're lucky, you know," Celeste said one afternoon, watching Naomi from across the room. Naomi barely looked up. "Am I?" Celeste's smile was sharp. "Ethan gets bored quickly. You might have his attention now, but don't get too comfortable." Naomi set down her book, meeting Celeste's gaze head-on. "I'm not comfortable," she said. "But let's be honest, you're the one who seems uncomfortable." Celeste's nostrils flared. Naomi stood, stepping closer. "You think I don't see it?" she continued. "The way you look at him? The way you try so hard to prove yourself? But guess what, Celeste? You don't matter to him either." Celeste's face darkened. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Naomi smirked. "Oh, trust me," she said. "I do." And just like that, she walked away. Round 2. Naomi. That night, Ethan came home late. Naomi was sitting in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through a book, when she heard him enter. Something about the way he moved caught her attention. Normally, Ethan walked with the confidence of a man who owned the world. Tonight, his shoulders were tense. His jaw was tight. Without thinking, Naomi spoke. "Bad day." Ethan froze for a moment, as if surprised she had even acknowledged him. Then, with a sigh, he loosened his tie and dropped onto the couch across from her. "You could say that." Naomi closed the book, tilting her head. "Tell me." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Why would I do that?" Naomi shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe because there's no one else around?" He studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he actually answered. "I lost a deal today," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "It was a sure thing. I had everything lined up. Then, at the last second, the client backed out." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "And you're not used to losing." Ethan smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Not particularly." Naomi leaned back against the couch. "Maybe it's good for you," she said. Ethan arched an eyebrow. "Losing?" Naomi nodded. "Keeps you human." Ethan stared at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally he let out a breath. "Maybe," he admitted. Naomi smiled slightly. "See? Progress." Ethan shook his head, but there was the ghost of a smile on his lips. "You really are something else," he muttered. Naomi just shrugged. She didn't know why. But for the first time, she felt like she had seen a glimpse of something real beneath his armor, something human, and it made her dangerously curious. The next morning, Naomi woke up to something strange. On the nightstand beside her bed was a small black box. She frowned, picking it up. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet. Simple, elegant, and completely unexpected. There was a note. For holding your ground. E. Naomi stared at it for a long time. Then slowly she smiled. The bracelet stayed in its box for 3 days. Naomi wasn't sure why she hesitated. Maybe because it felt like a test. Maybe because accepting it would mean acknowledging something she wasn't ready to face. That Ethan Sinclair was changing. Or worse, that she was. But on the 4th day, as she was getting ready for bed, she finally slipped it onto her wrist. It was a perfect fit. And when she saw Ethan the next morning, something flickered in his expression. He had noticed, and for the first time, he didn't look away. Naomi's life in the penthouse had settled into something dangerously close to a routine. Morning breakfasts were no longer a battlefield. She still pushed back against Ethan when necessary, but she noticed that he listened now. Even Celeste had toned down her hostility, though Naomi knew it was only temporary. And then came the training. Ethan had arranged for Naomi to take etiquette, self-defense, and public speaking lessons, not because he wanted her to thrive, but because he wanted her to fit into his world. Still, Naomi had never been one to turn down an opportunity to grow stronger, even if it meant playing by his rules. For now, the first time Naomi met Marcus Kane, her self-defense instructor, she knew she was in trouble. Marcus was 6'4", built like a wall of muscle, and had the presence of a drill sergeant. "You're late," he said the moment she stepped into the private gym. Naomi frowned. "I was told to be here at 10. Marcus checked his watch. "It's 10:01. Naomi rolled her eyes. "Seriously?" His expression didn't change. "Your enemies won't wait for you to be on time." Naomi bit back a sarcastic remark. Ethan had warned her that Marcus was intense, but what he hadn't warned her about was how much Marcus would push her. The first session left Naomi on the floor, breathless and sore, in places she didn't know existed. Marcus stood over her, arms crossed. "Again," he ordered. Naomi groaned. "If you're trying to kill me, just be honest about it." Marcus smirked. "I'm trying to make sure you don't get yourself killed." And despite herself, Naomi liked him. Not in the way she despised Ethan at first. No. Marcus was different. He was tough but fair. And unlike Ethan, he wasn't trying to control her. He was trying to teach her. The etiquette lessons, however, were a nightmare. Madame Lorraine, a prim, razor-tongued woman in her 60s, made it her mission to turn Naomi into the perfect socialite. "Your posture is atrocious," Lorraine tisked. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "I'm sitting." "Like a farmhand," Lorraine snapped. "Straighten your back, chin up, and stop slouching like the weight of the world is on your shoulders." Naomi clenched her jaw. She had no patience for the way rich people obsessed over things that didn't matter. But then she caught Ethan watching, not smirking, not mocking, just watching. And that made her dig her heels in. Fine. If they wanted to play a game, she'd play. But she'd win. 2 weeks into her lessons, Naomi attended a private dinner Ethan hosted. It was the first time she had to prove herself. As expected, Gerald was there. So was Celeste, who looked positively thrilled to watch Naomi fail. Except she didn't. She held her own. She spoke with calm confidence. She used her fork correctly, because apparently that was important. And when Gerald tried to bait her with a condescending remark, she simply smiled and said, "It's funny, Gerald. You speak like someone who thinks he's important." but I don't see your name on any headlines." The silence was glorious. And across the table, Ethan smirked. She had won. But for some reason, it didn't feel like she was just winning against Gerald. It felt like she was winning Ethan's respect. And that was dangerous. Celeste didn't take defeat well, and Naomi knew she was planning something. So when Celeste cornered her in the hallway the next morning, Naomi wasn't surprised. "What do you want, Celeste?" Celeste's lips curled. "Just a friendly warning." Naomi crossed her arms. "I doubt that." Celeste stepped closer. "You think you're clever," she said. "You think you're playing Ethan. But you don't know him like I do. He doesn't change. He doesn't care. And you're just a means to an end." Naomi smiled, not because Celeste was wrong, but because Celeste was scared. "You sound nervous," Naomi said. "Afraid I might be more than you expected?" Celeste's jaw tightened. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Round 3, Naomi. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep, so she wandered the penthouse, eventually finding herself on the balcony. She wasn't alone. Ethan was there, whiskey in hand, tie loosened, staring at the city like it owed him something. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Ethan glanced at her. "Neither could you." Naomi sighed. "Too many thoughts." Ethan smirked. "Welcome to my world." They stood in silence for a while. Then, out of nowhere, Ethan spoke. "You're stronger than I expected." Naomi arched an eyebrow. Was that supposed to be a compliment? Ethan chuckled. "Maybe." Naomi turned to him, eyes searching. And for the first time she saw something different. A crack in the armor of arrogance. Something real. And that terrified her. Because the lines between them, the rules of their game, were beginning to blur. And she didn't know if she was ready for what that meant. There was something in the air. Electric, charged, dangerous. Naomi could feel it in the way the staff moved around the penthouse, their energy frantic. She could hear it in Celeste's sharp commands as she orchestrated every last detail of the gala. And most of all, she could see it in Ethan Sinclair. "You'll wear this," Celeste announced, tossing a garment bag onto Naomi's bed. Naomi arched an eyebrow. "No, please." Celeste's lips curled. "You're not in a position to demand manners." Naomi unzipped the bag and froze. The dress was a masterpiece, deep emerald green, flowing like liquid silk. She ran her fingers over the fabric, its softness foreign to her touch. For a second she wondered, who had chosen this? Celeste or Ethan? Celeste narrowed her eyes. "It's a gala, Carter. Try not to embarrass him." Naomi met her gaze, unwavering. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll make sure people remember me." And she meant it. An hour later, Naomi descended the grand staircase. The air shifted the moment she stepped into the room. All eyes were on her, not in mockery, not in pity, but in shock. And at the center of it all, Ethan Sinclair stood frozen. He had seen Naomi in many forms, defiant, angry, guarded. But this was something else entirely. "Well?" Naomi said, standing before him. "Say something." Ethan blinked once, then twice. "You'll do," he murmured, but his voice was hoarse. Naomi smirked. She had won this round. The Sinclair Gala was the event of the season. Powerful men, ruthless women, and an unspoken war of influence beneath the dazzling chandeliers. Naomi hated every second of it, until she saw Gerald Langford. And suddenly everything clicked. This wasn't just a party. It was a test. Gerald's smirk was razor-sharp as he approached. "Naomi," he drawled. "Or should I say Mrs. Sinclair?" Naomi held her ground. "Gerald." Stunning dress, he mused. You almost look like you belong here. Naomi's smile didn't falter. Funny, I was about to say the same about you. Ethan, standing beside her, let out a low chuckle. But Gerald wasn't done. You know, Ethan, he said smoothly, I remember the night you made that bet. Naomi's breath caught. Ethan's body tensed. And just like that, the entire room seemed to hush. Shall we dance? Ethan said, pulling Naomi onto the ballroom floor. Before Gerald could say another word, Naomi was furious. You were going to let him say it, she hissed. Ethan's grip tightened around her waist. I didn't let him do anything. Naomi glared. You're still playing games. Ethan's jaw clenched. I thought you liked winning. Her pulse skipped, because for the first time, it felt like this wasn't about the bet. It was about them. The music swelled, and suddenly Naomi realized she wasn't just following. Ethan was leading her into something dangerous, something real. Then, a whisper, a laugh, and suddenly Naomi heard her own name. Just a bet. Naomi froze. The words sliced through the music, through the moment, through her. She turned and saw Gerald smirking at her. Then she looked at Ethan and saw the truth in his silence. You confirmed it, she whispered. Ethan's expression shuddered. Naomi, don't, she breathed. Her vision blurred. Her chest tightened. And before Ethan could stop her, she ran. Naomi had no idea where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. Away from the lies. Away from Ethan. Away from the truth that had shattered her. Her dress billowed as she rushed through the darkened halls, past waiters, past security. And then, suddenly, a hand grabbed her wrist. Ethan. Let me go, she choked out. Ethan's grip didn't loosen. Listen to me. Naomi shoved him, hard. Hard enough that he actually stumbled. I was never your project, she spat. Ethan's chest rose and fell rapidly. You weren't, he said. Naomi's laugh was bitter. Then what was I, Ethan? He hesitated, and that was answer enough. Naomi ripped off the bracelet. The one he had given her. The one she had foolishly started to believe meant something. And she dropped it at his feet. I'm done, she whispered. Then she turned. And this time, Ethan didn't chase her. Ethan Sinclair had lost deals. He had lost fortunes. He had even lost battles in the boardroom. But he had never lost like this. He stood alone in the empty hallway, staring at the bracelet on the floor. And for the first time in his life, winning felt like losing. Naomi Carter had nowhere to go. She had spent most of her life learning how to survive. On the streets, in shelters, in places where people like Ethan Sinclair never dared to look. But nothing had prepared her for this, for what it felt like to be betrayed in front of 100 pairs of watching eyes, for what it felt like to realize she had let herself believe in him. Her feet pounded against the pavement. The green silk of her gown dragged through puddles, soaked from the remnants of an earlier rain. She had run blindly, past the flashing cameras, past the waiting limousines, past the crowd of glittering socialites who had stared at her as if she was nothing more than a scandal to whisper about in the morning. She didn't stop until she reached the old part of town, the part that still smelled like desperation and broken promises. Naomi pulled the pin from her hair, letting it tumble down her back. She needed to think. She needed to breathe. Most of all, she needed to forget. The sign was barely legible, faded and worn. The Haven House Shelter. Naomi hesitated before stepping inside. The scent of warm food and old books filled her lungs. The smell of safety. She had lived here once, a long time ago, before she lost everything, before she met Ethan. Naomi. The voice was soft, cautious, but familiar. Naomi turned, And for the first time that night, she saw a face she could trust. Tasha Jackson stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had changed since the last time Naomi had seen her. Her hair was shorter now, her posture tougher. But her eyes, they were the same, full of fire, full of fight. "You look like hell," Tasha said. Naomi let out a dry, humorless laugh. "It's been that kind of night." Tasha's gaze swept over her gown, her smeared makeup, her bare feet. "Let me guess," she said. "A man?" Naomi hesitated, then nodded. "Come inside," Tasha said, already turning. "We've got coffee." Naomi followed, her shoulders slumping, as the weight of the night settled over her. For the first time since she had run, she felt like she wasn't alone. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in the back of his limo, gripping the whiskey glass so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He hadn't gone after her, and that was the worst part. He had let Naomi walk away. He had let her believe she meant nothing. Gerald Langford's voice echoed in his mind. "You can dress her up, but you can't change what she is." Ethan slammed the glass onto the bar, the sharp crack of impact ringing through the silence. "Where is she?" he growled. His driver hesitated. "She's gone, sir." Ethan stared out the window, his own reflection glaring back at him, and for the first time in his life, he hated what he saw. By the time Ethan returned to his penthouse, it felt empty, like something had been ripped from its walls, leaving behind nothing but cold air and regret. He wasn't alone. Miriam, the elderly housekeeper, stood in the kitchen watching him. She had always been quiet, reserved, but tonight, she spoke. "You lost something real," she said. Ethan didn't respond. Miriam sighed. "You know why she ran, don't you?" Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "Because Gerald opened his mouth." Miriam shook her head. "No," she said softly. "Because you didn't stop him." Her words landed like a gut punch, because she was right. Ethan had stood there. He had let Naomi hear those words, let her look at him, and see nothing but the man she had feared he was all along. "You're better than this, Ethan," Miriam murmured. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if that was true. Hours passed. The city outside the penthouse never slept. But Ethan? He hadn't moved from his chair. The whiskey bottle sat untouched beside him now, because for the first time in years, he didn't want to drink away his problems. He wanted to fix them. He reached for his phone, dialed a number, and when the call connected, his voice was steady. "I need to find Naomi Carter." Naomi was halfway through her third cup of coffee when the shelter doors burst open. She didn't have to turn around. She already knew who it was. Ethan Sinclair stood in the doorway, his suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw set. He looked like hell. And Naomi? She felt nothing. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice flat. Ethan took a slow step forward. "I came to bring you home." Naomi laughed, and it wasn't soft. It was sharp, bitter, broken. "Home," she repeated. "You think I have a home with you?" Ethan's chest rose and fell, with uneven breaths. "I was wrong." Naomi crossed her arms. "About what?" "About you," Ethan said. "About all of it." Naomi's throat tightened. "You don't get to do this," she whispered. Ethan's jaw clenched. "Naomi, you don't get to chase me after you humiliated me," she snapped. "You don't get to act like this was some mistake you can fix." Ethan stepped closer, and despite herself, Naomi didn't move away. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Ethan said. His voice was low, rough. "Then why are you here?" Naomi whispered. Ethan held her gaze. "Because I can't stand the thought of losing you." For a moment, everything went silent. The city, the shelter, the air between them. Naomi opened her mouth, but she didn't know what to say, because this was Ethan Sinclair, a man who had everything, a man who had never once needed to ask. But tonight, he was asking for her. And that was something she never expected. The shelter felt smaller now. Or maybe it was just the weight of what stood between them. The words left unspoken, the damage already done. Naomi crossed her arms, her body rigid, as Ethan watched her from across the room. He had followed her here, tracked her down, and now he stood there, waiting. For what? For her to forgive him? For her to pretend like his words hadn't ripped through her like a blade? For her to go back? Naomi swallowed down the lump in her throat. You should leave. Ethan took a slow, measured breath. I can't. Naomi clenched her jaw. You don't have a choice. Ethan shook his head. You don't understand, he said, his voice hoarse. Naomi cut him off. Understand? She snapped. She stepped forward now, her heart hammering in her chest. I understand perfectly. Ethan's eyes darkened, his lips parting. But she didn't let him speak. I was a bet to you. The words slashed through the air. Ethan flinched. You made a deal, Ethan. You took my life and turned it into a joke. And now you want to… What? Apologize? Ethan ran a hand down his face, frustrated. Naomi, no. Her voice cracked through the room like lightning. Tasha, who had been standing near the kitchen, watching the scene unfold, took a cautious step forward. You good, Naomi? She asked. Naomi's breath was shaky, but she nodded. Ethan's fists tightened at his sides. He looked exhausted, worn down. But Naomi? She wasn't going to let herself fall for that look. Not again. She squared her shoulders. You don't get to do this, Ethan, she said, voice low but deadly. You don't get to walk in here and act like you suddenly care. Ethan stepped closer. And despite every instinct screaming at her to walk away, Naomi didn't move. I do care, Ethan said, voice rough with something too raw to name. Naomi laughed, bitter. Don't lie to me. I'm not, Ethan said immediately. He took another step forward. You think I don't know what I did? He demanded. You think I don't hate myself for… He stopped, swallowed hard. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I lost you. Naomi's throat tightened. Ethan took a breath. And then, I didn't know how much that would matter, he admitted. The words sat between them, heavy, unrelenting. And Naomi? She didn't know what to do with them, so she turned away. Ethan exhaled, his fingers brushing through his hair. Naomi, please. She froze. Ethan Sinclair never said please, ever. Her heartbeat stumbled. I know I don't deserve another chance, Ethan continued. His voice had lost its usual sharp edge. Instead, it was raw. But I need one anyway. Naomi forced herself to laugh, shaking her head. You think it's that easy? Ethan's lips pressed together. No, he said. And then, that's why I'm not asking you to come back. Naomi blinked, confused. What? Ethan let out a slow breath. I know I lost the right to ask for that, he said. So instead, I want to make you a deal. Naomi stared. She had no idea where this was going. You're not serious, she muttered. Ethan's jaw tightened. I am. Naomi scoffed. Another deal? After everything? This one's different, Ethan said. He held her gaze, unblinking. I want to help, he said. Naomi felt the air leave her lungs. I want to fund a foundation, Ethan continued, for women like you. For people like you. Naomi's chest ached. You don't have to say yes, Ethan added, his voice softer now. You don't have to believe me. But I'm going to do it anyway. Naomi's throat tightened. Because for the first time since she had met him, Ethan Sinclair wasn't offering her money. He was offering her a choice. Tasha stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You believe him?" she asked quietly. Naomi didn't answer, because she didn't know. All she knew was that for the first time since that night, she wasn't sure if she wanted him to leave. Ethan Sinclair didn't do things halfway. So when Naomi walked into the downtown office building, she wasn't surprised. Not really. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the sleek furniture, the name Emerald Hope Foundation, in bold silver lettering. It was all exactly what Ethan would do. But what surprised her was the desk with her name on it. Naomi stopped cold. "You can run it," Ethan said from behind her. She turned to face him. "You're serious?" she said. Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "Yes." Naomi's heart pounded. She didn't want to say yes. She didn't want to owe him anything. But she looked around. This was real. The people here, they needed this. She took a slow breath, and then, "Fine," she said. Ethan exhaled, but Naomi held up a hand. "On one condition," she said. Ethan stilled. "You don't get to call the shots," she said. Ethan smirked. "We'll see about that." Naomi narrowed her eyes. Ethan held out a hand. "Truce?" Naomi hesitated. Then, slowly, she took it. And everything changed. Naomi stood outside the towering glass building, her heart pounding against her ribs. The silver letters of Emerald Hope Foundation gleamed in the morning sun, a testament to something impossible. Ethan Sinclair had actually done it. And now, she had to decide if she was really going to be a part of it. She took a breath, then another. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she stepped inside. The lobby was pristine, the kind of place designed to impress. But something about it felt different. The receptionist looked up, offering a genuine smile. "Ms. Carter?" Naomi blinked. "Yeah." "Mr. Sinclair is expecting you." Naomi exhaled. "Of course, he is." The receptionist gestured toward the elevator. "Go on up. He's on the top floor." Naomi hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped inside. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling office. Ethan stood near the window, his back to her, staring at the city skyline. He looked different, like a man who hadn't slept, like a man who had been waiting for this moment. He turned as she stepped inside. "Naomi." Her stomach tightened. She crossed her arms. "Sinclair." Something flickered in his gaze. "You came. You gave me an office," she shot back. Ethan smirked. "You agreed to run the foundation?" Naomi tilted her head. "I said I'd consider it. Still counts." She exhaled sharply. "Do you always have to win?" Ethan's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened. "No," he admitted. "Not this time." Naomi's throat tightened. Because for the first time, there was no arrogance in his voice, just something raw, something she didn't know what to do with. Ethan gestured toward the conference table, where a thick stack of documents sat. Naomi narrowed her eyes. "What is this? Your contract?" Ethan said. Naomi froze. "My what?" Ethan exhaled. "I want you to run this place, Naomi. Fully. No conditions, no interference." Naomi stared. "You expect me to believe that?" Ethan held her gaze. "Yes." She crossed her arms. "And what do you get out of it?" Ethan's lips curled slightly. "A chance to prove I'm not the man you think I am." Naomi's chest tightened. She had no idea what to do with that. But she glanced at the papers, flipped through the pages, and there, at the bottom, her name, written next to a title that shouldn't have been possible. Naomi Carter, Executive Director. Her hands shook. "This is real?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. "Sign it," he said, voice steady. "And it's yours." Naomi swallowed. The pen felt heavy in her hand. She hesitated. Then she signed. And just like that, everything changed. The next few weeks were a blur. Naomi dove in head first. Meetings, press conferences, late nights. She was building something, and she was good at it. But there was one problem. Ethan. He was always there, lurking, watching, waiting. And Naomi felt it. Every time he walked into a room, every time his gaze lingered just a little too long, every time their fingers brushed by accident. It was dangerous. It was something she refused to acknowledge. But it was there, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could ignore it. One night, Naomi was in her office alone, working late. Ethan knocked on the door. "You're still here," he said. Naomi didn't look up. "Obviously," Ethan exhaled. "You should go home." Naomi finally looked at him. "Do I have a home?" The words hung in the air. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You do," he said softly. Naomi's chest ached. She looked away. "I don't know if I believe that." Silence. Then, Ethan took a slow step closer. "What if I could change that?" Naomi's pulse spiked. "Ethan, you don't have to answer," he said. "But I need you to listen." Naomi swallowed. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out a small black box. Naomi's breath hitched. He opened it, and there, inside, a ring. Naomi's stomach dropped. Her hand curled into fists. "You're not serious?" Ethan held her gaze. "I am." Naomi stood up. "You think you can just fix everything with a proposal?" Ethan's voice was steady. "This isn't about fixing things." Naomi glared. "Then what is it about?" Ethan exhaled. "You." Naomi's throat tightened. Ethan stepped closer. "Oh, this time," he said, voice low, firm. "This is real." Naomi's vision blurred. "Say yes," Ethan murmured. Naomi closed her eyes. Then she shook her head. "I can't." Ethan's breath caught. Naomi's heart shattered. Then quietly, Ethan nodded. "Okay," he said, and walked away. Naomi had spent the night pacing in her apartment. The moment kept replaying in her mind. Ethan standing there, holding that ring. His voice steady, his eyes sincere, and her own voice saying no. She had expected him to fight, to push, to remind her that she was supposed to be his project, his bet. But instead, he had simply accepted it. And that was what scared her the most. Because for the first time, Ethan Sinclair wasn't trying to win. He was just trying to love her. For the next 2 weeks, Ethan and Naomi barely saw each other. The foundation was thriving, media coverage, donations pouring in. Naomi was in the spotlight. And Ethan? He let her take it. No interference, no attempts to control, just support from a distance. And that was what broke her the most. Because the Ethan Sinclair she had met months ago, he would have never let go. And yet, here he was, proving he had changed, not with words, but with actions. Not everyone was happy about it. Celeste Monroe had been watching, waiting. And now, she saw her opportunity. Because if Ethan wasn't going to fight for Naomi, then Celeste would make sure Naomi had nothing left to fight for. It started with an anonymous tip to the press, a fabricated scandal. Headlines exploded. Naomi Carter, the woman who conned a billionaire. Was the Emerald Hope Foundation just a scheme? Insiders reveal the truth behind the relationship. And suddenly, everything Naomi had built, everything she had earned, was crumbling. Naomi stormed into Ethan's office. He was already reading the headlines. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched. "Tell me you had nothing to do with this," Naomi demanded. Ethan's gaze snapped to her. His voice was calm. "You think I would do this to you?" Naomi hesitated, because no, she didn't. Not anymore. But still, It has your name all over it, she whispered. Ethan exhaled sharply. Celeste. Naomi froze, and in that second, she knew. Ethan didn't hesitate. He called Celeste into the office, and when she walked in, she didn't even deny it. Her arms crossed, her smirk sharp. Finally figured it out, she taunted. Ethan's voice was cold. You tried to destroy her. Celeste laughed. I tried to protect you. Ethan took a slow, controlled breath. You're fired. Celeste's smirk vanished. You don't mean that. Ethan's voice was absolute. Get out. And just like that, she was gone. Ethan turned back to Naomi. I'll fix this, he said. But Naomi shook her head. You don't have to, she whispered. Ethan frowned. You don't want my help? Naomi hesitated. Then finally, I need to do this myself. Ethan's throat tightened. But then, he nodded. Because this time, he understood. Naomi faced the press. She walked onto that stage, not as a victim, not as Ethan's project, but as Naomi Carter, a woman who had fought her way through the darkest nights, a woman who had built something real. And when she spoke, the world listened. That night, Ethan waited for her outside the foundation. When she stepped out, he was already there, waiting, silent, respectful. Naomi stopped, stared at him. Then, why are you here? Ethan exhaled. Because I want to be. Naomi's heart raced. But I didn't say yes, she whispered. Ethan's lips curved, just slightly. I know, he said. And I'm still here. Naomi's throat tightened. Ethan took a slow step closer. This isn't a bet anymore, he murmured. It never was, Naomi whispered back. And just like that, the last of the walls between them shattered. Ethan hesitated, waited. Because this time, Naomi had to make the choice. And then, she did. She closed the space between them. Her lips met his. And for the first time, this wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about winning. It was just real. Ethan had been patient. He had waited. Not because he wanted to win, but because for the first time in his life, he understood. Naomi wasn't something to be claimed. She wasn't a prize to be won. She was Naomi Carter. And if she was going to be with him, it had to be her choice. The next few weeks felt different, lighter. For the first time, Ethan and Naomi worked together. Not as a billionaire and a project, not as a man fulfilling a bet, but as partners. Their foundation grew stronger. Naomi's name stood independent of his, and every time Ethan saw her, speaking at an event, helping a struggling mother, fighting for what she believed in, he felt something he had never felt before. Pride, not in himself, but in her. And that was how he knew. He had already fallen, hard. Naomi saw it too. The way Ethan's eyes softened when he looked at her. The way he never pushed, never controlled, never demanded. And yet, a part of her still held back. Because what if this was temporary? What if one day he woke up and realized that he didn't want her after all? That she wasn't polished enough, wasn't perfect enough, wasn't enough. So, Naomi did what she did best. She kept her walls up, and Ethan, he let her, because he knew she had to come to him. One evening, Naomi received a mysterious invitation, an event, a gala, hosted by Ethan Sinclair. She nearly tore it apart, because she refused to be part of his world again. But then, she saw the name on the invitation, not just his, Heron Naomi Carter, co-founder of the Emerald Hope Initiative, and beneath it, a handwritten note. This is not for me. It's for you. E.S. Naomi's breath caught. She hesitated. Then, she put on the only dress she owned that felt like her, and she went. It wasn't like before. It wasn't a room full of judgmental elites sipping champagne. It wasn't whispers of mockery. This time, it was her world. Advocates, survivors, people whose lives had been changed by the foundation. And Ethan? He was just there, watching from the corner. No speeches, no demands, just watching her shine. She should have known. The second she walked in, the second she saw what he had done, she should have known. Because Ethan Sinclair never did anything without a purpose. And this was his way of showing her that he saw her, that he believed in her, that he loved her. And Naomi, for the first time, she let herself believe it too. At the end of the night, Naomi stood before the crowd. She had spoken at events before. But tonight, this was different. Because she wasn't just speaking as an advocate. She wasn't just speaking as someone who had survived. She was speaking as Naomi Carter. And Ethan, well, he was in the front row, watching her, waiting. Naomi took a deep breath. She let her eyes meet his. Then, she said it. Once, someone told me that my worth could be measured in dollars, that I was nothing but a project, a game, a wager. The crowd stilled. Ethan's throat tightened. But the truth is, Naomi's voice didn't shake. I was never the one who needed saving. The audience erupted into applause. Ethan? He just smiled, because she had just set herself free. The crowd thinned. The night faded. But Naomi and Ethan, they remained, standing alone on the balcony. The city stretched out before them. And that's when Ethan did it. Not in front of cameras, not in front of the world, just for her. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small box. Naomi inhaled sharply. Ethan, don't say no yet. He opened it. Not a diamond, not $1 million ring, just a simple, delicate band, a reflection of her. This time, Ethan said, his voice steady. No bets, no conditions, no wagers. Naomi's heart pounded. Just us. A pause. A breath. Then, Naomi Carter, will you marry me? And this time, she knew. Because this time, she wasn't saying yes to a deal. She wasn't saying yes to a contract. She was saying yes to Ethan Sinclair. And that made all the difference. Naomi's breath caught. The crowd was silent. Because this was a man who had once been lost and had finally found his way home. Naomi had never written vows before. She had never imagined herself here. But when she looked into Ethan's eyes, the words came naturally. Ethan Sinclair, I once thought love was something people like me didn't get to have. That love belonged to the ones who had always been chosen, the ones who fit in. But then you came into my life, and at first you were everything I despised. Arrogant, distant, unreachable. But underneath it all there was someone else, someone who, against all odds, found a way to change. Not for me, but for himself. And that's the man I am standing here with today. A man who is no longer defined by what he owns, but by what he is willing to give. And Ethan, I don't want your money. I don't want your power. I want you. The crowd exhaled. There were tears. Because this wasn't just a wedding. This was a rebirth. For both of them. The officiant barely had time to finish the words. You may now kiss the bride. Before Ethan closed the distance, his lips met hers, and the world fell away. There were no expectations, no doubts, no debts, no bets, just them, just love. And this time, it was real. The reception wasn't extravagant. No 5-star chefs, no grand ballrooms. Instead, it was home-cooked food. It was music that made people dance. It was laughter, real, unfiltered laughter. Naomi stood with Miriam, Tasha, and the women from the shelter. And for the first time she felt something stronger than gratitude. She felt belonging. And Ethan, he stood among them. Not apart, not above, but with. And that was the real victory. At the end of the night, a letter was slipped into Ethan's hand. From Gerald, an invitation to a private club, a place where the old Ethan would have thrived, where bets were still placed on people. Ethan took one look at it and burned it, because he had made his choice, and his choice was Naomi, his wife, his future, his love, and he would never look back again. Naomi never thought she would find herself here, standing in a room filled with powerful people. Not as an outsider, not as a charity case, but as someone they listened to. She had been many things in her life: a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had spent too many nights wondering if the world would ever see her. And now they did. The Emerald Hope Initiative had started as a promise, a commitment between Naomi and Ethan to build something real. Now it was more than that. It was a movement, one that had helped hundreds of homeless individuals find housing, health care, and opportunities. And today, Naomi was about to step onto a stage and tell the world why it mattered. But not everyone wanted to see her succeed. Celeste Monroe, Ethan's former assistant, had waited for Naomi to fail, waited for Ethan to come to his senses. But he hadn't. He had chosen Naomi. And now, Celeste had one final card to play, a leaked story. One that questioned Naomi's past, how she had lived on the streets, how she had been part of a bet, how, no matter how much she changed, she would never belong. The morning of the event, Naomi woke up to the whispers. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Exposed. The truth about Naomi Sinclair's rise to power. A rags to riches story. Or a cunning scheme? Billionaire's wife. A woman with a hidden past. The air thickened around her. Her hands trembled as she read the headlines. She could already see it. The judgment. The way the world would turn her back into what she had fought so hard to escape. For a moment, she wanted to run, like she always had. But then, a hand touched hers. "Look at me." Ethan's voice was steady, unshaken. She did, and in his eyes, she saw certainty. "They don't get to define you," he said. "They don't get to rewrite your story." Naomi let out a shaky breath. "Ethan, they'll use this to tear us apart." He shook his head. "They can try." And then, he did something unthinkable. He called a press conference, and for the first time he spoke first. Ethan stood in front of the cameras. The world watched, waited, expected him to do what men like him always did, to distance himself, to protect his reputation. Instead, he shattered every expectation. Yes, Naomi Carter was homeless. Yes, she lived a life most of you will never understand. And yes, I once made the worst mistake of my life by treating her as anything less than the incredible woman she is. Silence. But she is not a scandal. She is not a fraud. She is my wife. And I am the luckiest man alive to stand beside her. His voice shook the room. If that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe it's not Naomi's past that needs to change. Maybe it's yours. And just like that, the world shifted. Later that night, Naomi sat in their home, staring at the city lights. "You didn't have to do that." Ethan sat beside her. "Yes, I did." A pause, a breath. "I used to think love was about winning," Ethan admitted. "But love isn't a game. It's a choice." Naomi turned to him. "And do you choose me, Ethan Sinclair?" A soft smile. "Every damn day." And this time, she believed him. The next morning, Naomi walked onto the stage. The room hushed. She took a breath and spoke. "When I was a child, I used to watch people walk past me on the street. I used to wonder if they ever saw me, if they ever wondered who I was before I ended up there. Today I stand before you, as proof of one simple truth: people are not disposable. I was never nothing. I was always someone. And so are the hundreds of thousands of people still out there, waiting to be seen. Her voice rose. We are not statistics. We are not failures. We are not invisible. A beat, a moment, and we will no longer be ignored. The applause shook the room, and Naomi, for the first time, knew she had finally won. A year ago, Naomi Carter had been invisible. Now she stood at the center of something bigger than herself. The Emerald Hope Initiative was no longer just a dream. It was a movement, one that had helped thousands find shelter, stability, and dignity. One that had proved that love, real love, was not a bet. It was a commitment. At the Foundation's first anniversary gala, Naomi walked through the crowd. She wasn't looking for celebrities or press coverage. She was looking for them, the people who had come through their doors broken and had walked out whole again. There was Diana, the single mother who had escaped an abusive marriage. There was Malik, the young boy who had spent years on the streets, now thriving in school. There was Mrs. Evelyn, the elderly woman who had been abandoned by her family, now working as a mentor for young women trying to rebuild their lives. You did this? Ethan whispered as he watched Naomi take it all in. Naomi turned to him, eyes filled with something soft, yet fierce. No, she said, we did. And for the first time in his life, Ethan believed in something greater than himself. Their home had changed, not in size, not in luxury, but in heart. The penthouse that once felt cold, sterile, untouchable, now echoed with laughter. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was theirs, a place where Naomi could be barefoot in the kitchen, music playing as she prepped dinner, a place where Ethan could sit on the floor, books spread out, brainstorming ideas for the foundation, a place where they could breathe. I used to think success was about control, Ethan admitted one night as they sat on the balcony. Now, Naomi asked. Ethan exhaled, his gaze locked on hers. Now, I think it's about who you build with. And Naomi, for the first time, let herself believe that she had finally found home. It happened on a quiet afternoon. A knock at the door. When Naomi opened it, she froze. Gerald Langford, the man who had set everything in motion. Surprised, he smirked. Naomi didn't answer. She simply stepped aside, letting Ethan face the man who had once been his closest friend. Ethan's jaw tightened. You have 5 minutes, he said coldly. Gerald chuckled, stepping inside. I came to see what all the fuss is about, he said, glancing around. The great Ethan Sinclair, now playing philanthropist. Naomi braced herself. She knew men like Gerald, men who thrived on power, manipulation, control. But Ethan was different now. You think this is a game? Ethan asked. Gerald shrugged. You tell me, Sinclair. You spent your whole life making deals, placing bets. So tell me, what's the end game here? Is this all just another play? Naomi stiffened. But Ethan laughed. Not cold, not bitter, just amused. You still don't get it, do you? Ethan said, shaking his head. Enlighten me, Gerald smirked. Ethan leaned forward. The bet didn't change Naomi, he said, his voice steady. It changed me. Gerald's smirk faltered. You lost, Ethan continued. Not because I won, Naomi, but because I stopped playing your games. I found something you never will. He glanced at Naomi and smiled. A life worth living. Silence. For the first time, Gerald had nothing to say. And just like that, he turned and walked away. Naomi exhaled, feeling a weight she didn't even realize she was still carrying lift. Ethan wrapped his arm around her waist. Let's stop letting ghosts knock on our door, he murmured. Agreed, Naomi whispered. And just like that, the last piece of their past was finally gone. 6 months later, the Emerald Hope Initiative had expanded to 3 new cities. Naomi was being recognized nationally for her work. Ethan had completely stepped away from the ruthless business world he had once ruled. And together, they were planning something even bigger. It's time, Ethan said one evening. Naomi frowned. For what? He handed her a folder. Inside, plans for a community center, a permanent space designed to house, educate, and employ those who had nowhere else to go. We don't just need shelters, Ethan said. We need a future for them. Naomi's heart swelled. She turned to him, eyes shining. This is it, Ethan. This is how we change everything. Not we, he corrected. You. And for the first time in her life, Naomi Carter didn't just feel like someone who had survived. She felt like someone who had built something, someone who had won. Not because of money, not because of power, but because of love. Because love was never a bet. It was a choice. And they had chosen each other. As Naomi and Ethan stood side by side, watching the world they had built together, one thing was clear. This was never about a bet. It was about transformation, about choosing love over pride, about proving that no one is beyond redemption. But what do you think? Drop a comment below. Did Ethan deserve Naomi's love? Would you have forgiven him? Or do you think love, once tainted by a wager, can never be real? And don't forget, this isn't the end. Every story has a new beginning. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. Because trust me, it's going to be even more unforgettable. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and be ready for another powerful story that will leave you speechless. Because sometimes, the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most extraordinary endings. Blast off.